Doug, good evening. This is the deeper dive of the South Carolina Progressive Network that takes place between the times when we just talk at you. This is your turn to talk, but I'm going to start the talking by throwing something at you that I just have to keep reading because it's so fascinating that it was something that I only learned in putting together the Becky's history book that this op-ed piece that ran in the New York Times in 2011 by Professor Blight from Yale, who is one of outstanding African American historians, wrote this piece about the first Memorial Day that I sent to everybody. Raise your hand if you saw the piece I sent. Okay, so I won't bore you by talking about it. The piece is called "Forgetting Why We Remember," and that's like a torturous kind of string of words to try and remember. But the thrust of it is the erasing of history by people who write history, who are known as the winners. And so this piece that I sent, that you must read, is only 2 pages long, 2 short pages of large type long. It's an op-ed piece in the newspaper. It talks about Charleston being the first place that falls big time in the spring of 1865. The war's still going on. The white people pretty well split in Charleston. And so the Union troops move in, and the black people, delighted they're there, greet them with song and dance. And on May 1, shortly after I don't have a date for exactly what day they hit the ground. Somebody here may know when the Union troops, they've been coming in for a while that spring. But on May 1, they being the people who are running the town then, had a march to honor the Union troops dead. And the racetrack, there's a racetrack there called the Washington, Washington something, anyway, the Washington racetrack and jockey lot, where they had fancy horse races for the bourgeoisie. And they used that as a burial grounds for Union troops. It was a prison for Union troops by the Confederacy. Over 270 Union troops buried there. And so that was where 10,000 black Charlestonians, led by 3,000 children, marched on May 1, 1865 for the first Memorial Day. And that was lifting up their liberation and their liberators. I don't remember how I forgot that. It was probably being raised in South Carolina and learning that the War of Northern Aggression was really over economics. And that was what I was taught in high school. But it's just a phenomenal thing that happened in South Carolina that I forgot why I didn't remember that. And that's because they didn't want me to. And there's so much they don't want us to remember. Part of that is the old trope, no matter which war we're talking about. Whose war was it, who benefited from it, and who died? Rich man's war, poor man's fight. Somebody else got a thought about something you remember you forgot or forgot to remember? Surely somebody has
I do.
Thought. Lewis, go for it.
Am I on? Am I being heard?
Turn yourself up some, or I'll turn myself up some. I'll both help.
I don't know how. Is that any better?
Good.
Okay. Well, I start out with great credit to Becky Robbins and the book Hidden History. And I just thought it was so phenomenally relevant, and I don't think I knew it till when her book came out. The National Negro Youth Conference at the Township Auditorium in 1946 that was attended by thousands of people, and W.E.B. Du Bois puts it on him and talks about the firing line for the international struggle to liberate not just the African Americans in the U.S., but Africans in Western Africa and the white folks, and calls for racial unity to overthrow the monopoly capitalist, ruling class. That's just so important for us to know how progressive that movement was way back, and not let it be just about being able to buy a hamburger at Woolworths and that we need to have that sort of class solidarity, not to not talk about the racism that is so rampant and disproportionately destroys people. But anyway, I thought that was phenomenal. So I downloaded the booklet and I'm starting to send it around to other colleagues and comrades to remind them of that. It's just a good reminder. And in honor of all that, I don't know if you can see, I wore my shirt. I don't know what it looks like on your screen, but it says capitalism is organized crime. And I think I probably first said that or learned that term at some utility struggle in Columbia with Brett and Tom Turnipseed and others.
But you had an experience dealing with some killings in Greensboro that pretty clear that it was a federal government hit squad. Did people get that? Do they remember it? Speak to that.
No, because once again, it's so covered up. It was, they tried to cover it up. They can't cover it up. Then it's the spin that it was just a bunch of out-of-towners and a bunch of communists and Klan, and everybody hates either side of it, and they had a shootout. So you put that spin on it, but in fact, it was in effect a North American hit squad that murdered 5. It was a multiracial group, a guy who'd come up from Cuba, African-American woman, Jewish doctor, 2 doctors, just the cream of the crop of activists there in 1979 who had given up careers that they could have utilized in the upper class to go to work as part of the Workers' Viewpoint organization. The FBI knew about it and was in on it. Al-Qaeda and Firearms was in on it. The Greensboro Police Department was in on it, fully orchestrated, and in front of 3 or 4 TV channels, cameras. They rolled in a 9-car caravan, followed by the handler of the undercover Klan guy, who was in the lead car that the police were paying to drive them there, and opened fire and murdered 5 people and wounded about a dozen others in an African-American neighborhood, and essentially terrorized the whole community there. And it was atrocious and still is. So if I could take a moment, that was 1979. There were 2 criminal trials, a state trial, which you can imagine they barely went after the 5 Klansmen. There was no information provided to those jurors, all-white jury, about the undercover full-time federal agent and the Nazis and the police informant undercover in the Klan, which was showed all the pre-planning. They hid that acquittal. We had to fight and fuss and mobilize the people to press the Justice Department to bring a federal criminal prosecution, all-white jury, another acquittal. And then we brought our civil rights lawsuit in behalf of the widows and the victims who were terrorized. It came to trial in 1985 after doing a year of discovery and forcing out all that evidence, and fortunately got a sort of a half-assed verdict that at least held jointly liable for wrongful death 2 or 3 Klansmen, 2 or 3 Nazis, and 2 or 3 Greensboro police officers. But that was far from any meaningful relief. Then we can scroll forward to the community. The community gets credit for all of this, not the power structure, demanding that there be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Greensboro. And this fact is missed a lot. It's the first, and far as I know, the last in the universe that was raised by the people over and against the established government. We automatically think of South Africa, man. Well, that was after Mandela was in power. And you could have the establishment credibility to call for it. Here, our city council and virtually any other established power was still poo-pooing it. They can't forget. They're stuck back in the past. Let's move on. people convened it. It released a report about a year later, and people from around the world have come to Greensboro to get guidance from Reverend Nelson Johnson, his wife Joyce Johnson, and others that helped trigger that Truth and Reconciliation movement. And one final point, one aspect of the recommendations from that Truth Commission was to have a curriculum in the high schools, in the public schools, to teach about that because it's been so covered up. And just roughly a year ago, have they begun to sort of informally sneak that curriculum in through a few really courageous social worker teachers. But the hope is to get that to be part of a curriculum. Frankly, just like the Modjeska School curriculum should be part of all K through 12 curriculum throughout the nation. We'd have a hell of a lot better country and a better chance of ever having a self-governing democracy. Thanks for letting me be long-winded on that.
No, thank you, Liz. We spoke about this briefly when we were going through the chronology, and there is a link to the Point of View movie that was made and shown on your study guide, and that Lewis mentioned that the city was trying to cover that up. And who was it that they hired to come? It was a chill out person. You remember?
From the federal government, you mean?
No, the one that city police hired.
Oh, well, they were paying a guy named Edward Dawson.
No, Cleve Sellers is who we're.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get your drift. Yes.
So yeah.
Sometime after that, the Greensboro police or the city hired a relatively young, I guess, African American that everybody knows is going to tell it like it is Cleveland Sellers, and he perpetuated the cover-up line.
Former SNCC guy. It was he disappeared after the Orangeburg shooting, in my view. And next time I heard from him, it was a call from a friend in Greensboro. I wanted to know, hey, you know this guy named Cleveland Sellers, who then went on to become a PhD Black History professor and head of the African American Studies Department at the university. But thank you, Lewis, so much. Before we move on to somebody else who's remembering to forget something, do y'all have any questions about what Lewis was just talking about?
Were you familiar with any of that? Probably so, because most of y'all are pretty deeply.
We touched on it in the curriculum. We didn't make people watch the movie. I'll come back. Maybe we'll show the movie and have a Zoom on that. But it's very difficult to convince somebody today that, like third world countries, we had a federal government hit squad that identified people they wanted dead. These federal agents gave the shooters pictures of the 5 people that were dead. And this is not something this is not our hyperbolic kind of spin on this thing. Lewis's attorney, we've got the data. We had discovery. And that's pretty scary when you get to be really effective. And the people that were killed, like Lewis said, they were the best and brightest, quit their real jobs, got to work at a textile mill to organize working class union as open communists. And they were elected. And that scared the crap out of the man. And so what? They called the government and shot him. Bang. Next story. Who's next? Dr. Gallman, I see you are visiting the pyramids today. You have bringing wisdom back from the old country. We can't hear you. We see your mouth moving.
Racist historiography has been around for a long time. And 2 areas that I'm particularly fond of looking at and interested in are, number one, the fact that nothing has been written on the fact that Black folk actively fought back against slavery and against Jim Crow. And it was almost, the way that everything is written is like we were just poor, innocent people that all this happened to. But obviously the truth, when you consider the Maroons and the multiple slave revolts, and I'm especially fond of looking at the Red Summer of 1919, when all over the country, there was armed conflict, and you don't hear very much about that. The other thing that I'm very, very interested in is I really get perturbed that everything that happened is called the civil rights movement. There was something called the Black Power movement, which is not to be conflated with the civil rights movement. And they existed simultaneously. And you have people, for instance, like Kwame Ture, the former Stokely Carmichael, who is called a civil rights worker. And he actually coined the phrase Black Power. So, I'm actually working on a paper to deal with that, because I think that we do a great number of people a disservice, because so much was accomplished by the Black Power movement. As a matter of fact, they were used as a wedge by people like Martin Luther King, who said, would you rather deal with us or would you rather deal with him? And I think that is very important. And that's one of my pet peeves, and something that I'm working to try to expose now.
Thank you, Dr. Gallman. I want to recognize that Dr. Shaw and Dr. Hale, our faculty adjuncts, are with us now, and they're certainly welcome to shut me up and take over. And we have another comment from somebody?
Can I say something about SNYC that Lewis brought up? It was a bright spot in an otherwise really dark bit of mucking around in history that I had to do for the book that you mentioned. But one of the things that most struck me about the leadership of that was that they made a conscious effort to include women in leadership positions. Ed Strong made sure and kind of pushed Esther Jackson out of her comfort zone to take on, a very visible national public persona with the organization, which was pretty rare at the time and still is. And part of that was helped by the fact that the men went off, a lot of them went off to serve in the war. And so women were there trying to keep the organization afloat, and they didn't just keep it afloat, they thrived. And I think there's a lesson for all of us in that. It's like, if space is made for women to step into, they will rise to the occasion. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is just, we're getting ready to talk about projects coming up in a couple of classes. We'll be ending with what folks are going to do after they graduate from the school, and how are they going to use what they've learned. As part of the research for that booklet, Graham Duncan, who is instrumental in the Modjeska Simkins School, he's a librarian at the Caroliniana at the University of South Carolina, went to Howard University on his own time and brought back a box full of documents, first person letters and correspondence, and some photographs. And but what was most compelling were the stuff that the students had compiled when they did they established 11 chapters around South Carolina. And so we've got thing about their organization. A couple of them did newsletters that talks about the projects they were doing, and how they kept alive what they learned at the Leadership Institute that Modjeska set up in '46 in Columbia at Harbison. So there's some of the stuff, they were just the most beautiful documents. And I mean that, I'm not a librarian, but even I can really see the beauty in the writing and in the intent and the intensity and the commitment of these students. And some of them were, 17 years old, 18, 19 years old. And I think it would be really cool as a project for the Modjeska School to take some of those original documents and archive them, scan them, make them more publicly available, and also try to track down some of the people that were involved. I mean, there may be a handful of them that are still alive and kicking, and I think it would be wonderful to do some oral histories before it's too late. So those are my thoughts on that.
Thank you, Becky. And Becky's book is available online, and you can get a hard copy by sending me money. And I wanted to mention for those that are tuning in late that this conversation is being kicked off, so you can talk about things that have been erased from your history. And I used a editorial that was in the New York Times in 2011 about the first Memorial Day being in Charleston in 1865, while the war was still going on, led by 10,000 people of color that had just been freed, that is forgotten, and we're remembering why it's forgotten. So somebody else remember what they forgot. I don't know. Cecily, you didn't grow up here, but I bet you forgot something you learned in high school.
Well, that's not how I interpreted the question the first time you asked it, Brett, so I'll have to think about that.
Well, the question is, you were taught something that wasn't true. And so you didn't learn what was true. So you're remembering what you forgot. I mean, it's a torturous term.
Oh, sure. In North Carolina, of course, you hear about all of the, when you're growing up in North Carolina, you go through 4th grade and 8th grade North Carolina state history, you learn all about the wars and the battles, not wars, but battles that were fought inside North Carolina that we won, but not a whole lot about battles that were lost in North Carolina, or people who lived in the Carolina colony at the time who were opposed to separating from Great Britain. But then when I moved to South Carolina, I learned that the same thing was true here, that a large number of the folks who lived in the backcountry, what was called the backcountry at the time, the upstate now, were in support of separating, but Charlestonians did not want to separate from Great Britain, and as a matter of fact, there were people at the time writing, this is contemporaneous accounts, who said that Charleston was more English than London in the years leading up to the Revolutionary War, because they were so in love with, these were their, kith and kin, and why would we want to separate from our people? And then I didn't learn in history either, only learned later that after the Revolutionary War, a large number of, not a majority by any means, but a large number of Charlestonians left and repatriated to Great Britain rather than to continue to live in South Carolina as a state in the United States, which was a shock to me. More recently, though, in terms of history, not more recently this past few weeks or months, but in terms of history, what I find equally interesting is events like the killing of Narciso Gonzalez in 1903, the editor of the state newspaper, the murder of him in broad daylight. Well, he died 3 days after being shot, but in broad daylight, in the company of sitting state senators at the capital of Maine and Gervais, I think, or over on that corner of the State House complex where Jimmy Burns' statue stands today, where the editor of the newspaper, the state newspaper, was shot in broad daylight by the sitting lieutenant governor of South Carolina, who was Ben Tillman's nephew, James Tillman. And people don't know this. When I was lobbying the State House, and I would ask people about this, no, but I can't cite a single person who knew about this. And the only reason that the only mention of it that I can tell in three-dimensional world is that obelisk over on what is it? Is it the western side of the State House complex? Just across the street, across Senate Street maybe, from the Cahoon building, is an obelisk. Looks like the Washington Monument. And I didn't know why we had a miniature Washington Monument in Columbia. I walked over and read the inscription on it. This was many years when I first moved here, and read who Narciso Gonzalez was, and that he had been killed, and that the money for the obelisk, the reason it's not on the State House complex is because the money for it was raised by his supporters, his friends, and placed there where it is, not by the state. Likewise, the monument to the Confederate soldier on the front edge of the State House complex was not originally placed there. It was originally put out in Elmwood Cemetery. by what was it? The Daughters of the Confederacy, I think, raised the money for that in the 1860s or something like that, 70s. Placed in Elmwood Cemetery, and only during some remembrance ceremony in the 1870s, after Reconstruction was over, did they choose to move that statue to the State House complex, whereupon the head of it was struck by lightning and blown off. Did you all know this? The head of the original head of the Confederate memorial on the State House complex was struck by lightning and blown off. The original head now resides in the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia. They had to carve a new one to put up on the top of the statue. What else don't we isn't taught that ought to be? Well, I'll come back.
We need to have a trivia game, guys.
Oh, sure.
Awesome.
I've mentioned this one before in this group, that we pay attention to what happened at Honeypath, thanks in part to the documentary, The Uprising of 34. But something equally important happened 22 years later in Darlington, which when Roger Milliken closed down the Darlington Manufacturing Company, because the Textile Workers Union had organized it and the employees at that location had voted to unionize. He had threatened for months ahead of time that if they voted to unionize, he would close it. They did not believe that he would, because he had spent millions of dollars investing in that location. He had 22 plants across the region, and in that one location, he had spent millions installing European looms in order to produce textiles that he could market to Europe. And based upon that fact, the employees there didn't think that he would follow through on his promise. Indeed, they voted to unionize. He closed down the plant, sold off by auction piece by piece that December. That happened in October of '56, sold it off in December, and it was gone. The reason why I say that that was just as important as what happened in Honeypath was because the litigation that came from that, the union and the unionized employees sued, and he kept it tied up in court. It made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And the litigation wasn't, it stated that a business owner could choose to close down the business, and the fact that as a response to efforts to unionize, and the unionized workers had no recourse, but the impact, the remunerative impact was that the Supreme Court ruled he had to pay back wages for those people that he had fired. And of course, by the time he actually got around to doing it, Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, and so many of the employees had died. And so there was no, justice delayed is justice denied, and may as well not have been justice at all. That's why, in my opinion, that's as important. And nobody talks about that, even in the labor movement, the union community in South Carolina.
We'll factor that into our next plan. Thank you much. I want to bring in some women's voices in this. Dr. Shaw, you want to take it and do some facilitating? And some women, make the women talk.
Give them a chance to talk.
Yes. Open up a pathway for a greater dialogue. Much appreciated. So yeah, let me just sort of ask, in what ways this theme of remembrance resonates with other members of the class, and what other things we've covered, or other things that we have yet to cover that you think we need to bring into our discussion for this evening. And
well, I always feel like the odd person out, because I know absolutely nothing about South Carolina history except what you guys tell me. But listening to the question, what things do we forget? The instant thing that I think of is Harriet Tubman. As a person with epilepsy, she is always my go-to, as both a person I bring up as an example, but also as a personal hero, because she is also a person with epilepsy. And nobody ever talks about that. They just did a movie on her life, and that was just left out completely. How do you run people back and forth while you're getting shot at and people are threatening to kill you and you're having grand mal seizures? And I think that that's symptomatic of a greater problem of erasure of disability history and disability culture. And then when we talk about the 504 protests, we forget that the 504 protests were not only people with disabilities, which is symptomatic of whitewashing disability history. When we look back at disability history, we only see white people. We see a disability hierarchy, and that wasn't true. The Black Panthers were highly involved in the 504 protests. There was a strong lesbian presence in the 504 protests. The 504 protests would not have been successful. That sit-in would not have been successful at all if it weren't for the Black Panthers or for a smaller organization of lesbians who were able to bring food and water and provide bathing opportunities for people, and that is commonly forgotten. And then more recently, we forget about ADAPT and the fact that people even still to this day are being physically harmed by the police and police brutality in our disability culture. We forget about what's going on, and it just recently stopped, but we forget what's going on at the Rottenberg Educational Center and how ADAPT sat outside of Rottenberg every day for years, and they were attacked by the police. They slept outside. It didn't matter what the weather was because people were receiving electroshock therapy inside and being brutalized both inside and outside. We talk about rights to marriage and the right to vote, and people with disabilities don't have those rights. They don't have the right to be parents. They don't have the right to vote. They don't have the right to love who they love, because many people with disabilities, again, disability hierarchy, but many people with disabilities are not considered citizens of this country. And that doesn't matter what their race is or what their sexuality is or their gender orientation is, because a lot of people with disabilities aren't allowed to identify what their gender orientation or their sexuality or any of that is. They're told. And so I think all of those things are forgotten, and I think sometimes when we have those discussions, we forget them. And so those are big things for me as an advocate. And then as an Arab American, I think a lot of times we forget that there's a lot of microaggression in this country towards Middle Eastern Americans and also towards Asian Americans who are perceived to be Middle Eastern Americans, and people are too ignorant to know the difference. So that was everything that was coming into my mind. I have a lot of that microaggression happen towards me because oftentimes people can't look at me and go, oh, she's the Arab American. So that happens a lot. And so those were all the things that I was thinking when that question was asked.
If I could bring something up in response to something, I've always been taught that Harriet Tubman had temporal lobe epilepsy and not grand mal epilepsy. And in fact, the movie actually alluded to the symptoms of temporal lobe epilepsy without using the term. And so if you have some information about her having had grand mal seizures. I'm interested in getting that.
So there's several different rumors and versions of that story. I think the consensus is that she suffered a head injury at the hands of the person who had who was in charge of her or felt that way at the time, and they beat her and she suffered a head injury. And so that caused her to start having some form of seizure disorder. There are different descriptions of what that looked like and what those symptoms were throughout history. Some of them are as low as she had what's called blackout seizures, where you would just kind of cross your arms and do this, and some of them have descriptions of her doing what I do, which I joke about and say stop, drop, and flop, which are grand mal seizures. And there are different descriptions in between. I don't think anybody will ever know, because we don't have a recording of her having a seizure. But personally, I don't really think it matters, I guess. But seizures aren't fun for anybody.
Right, and I guess to your point, Tiffany, how to unpack the movie's inference about spiritual revelation versus this question of health condition and disability.
Right, and the history of associating religion with epilepsy is such a greater form of ableism than anything, because I was interviewing Tony Coelho like on Friday or Thursday or Friday, and if you don't know, he's the former Democratic majority congressional whip, and he also is a person with epilepsy, and he helped write the ADA, and he was talking about how he almost became a priest, and he was unable to become a priest and ended up becoming a congressional representative, because it's still in canon law that if you have epilepsy, you are possessed by the devil. And as a person who's religious, which I am, I have been told my entire life that if I pray hard enough, God will take my seizures away. Well, I had a seizure this week, and I don't ever want to have a seizure again. But I also don't think that God wants me to have a seizure, but I don't want to be cured either. My seizures are part of who I am. And so the fact that people look at me like God doesn't like me as much as God likes you, or that I have demonic possession. I mean, people would kill their children because they had seizures. They burned people at the stake as being witches because they had convulsions.
Right.
And the fact that we're still perpetuating that as a stereotype is just horrendous to me.
Yep. Yeah, I would say, so I'm going to talk with a group of undergraduate students tomorrow with an online class about the thinking of and theorizing of Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, and who sort of brought to the fore this theory of intersectionality, right? And so in what ways are these layers of layers of oppression, but also layers of connection to community, fundamental to really kind of understanding, to have a fuller picture of any hero. And so in this case, this particular hero, Shiro of Tubman, what's the story to be told? It's a heroic story, but then what are the human elements that are being left out in rushing to create a human portrait, a very human portrait? And so, yeah, I hear you that as we look at this through these lenses of history, it's really quite important to recognize these layers it's fundamentally important to recognize how leaving out layers are leaving out entire communities that could take on the individuals as their own story, as their own narrative to embrace.
And I'll stop at this, but I do think I want to mention, because you did bring up intersectionality and you did bring up Kimberly Crenshaw, who is also a Shiro, in my opinion. But I don't want to speak for the Black community because I'm not part of the Black community, but I do know that faith is such a big part of that. And then I imagine that faith was a big part of Harriet Tubman's experience, and I would imagine that it was a big part of the way that she interpreted what was going on for her in her life. And when we address that from a historical perspective, you don't want to negate that. And when you look at a whole person, when you look at me and my experience with my disability, I don't want anybody to negate that either. But at the same time, when you're looking at disability, you have to be careful not to oppress somebody with any of those other elements. So you can't oppress them with the religious aspect, because by telling that story only in that way, you're not telling it, you're oppressing the future people who are looking at them as a potential idol or as a potential person to say, oh, well, if they had that experience, then, I can do something with my life too.
Right. So telling the full truth. Right. Thank you. Other voices, folk who haven't got an opportunity. Jon Hale?
Yeah, Todd Shaw, I just want to quick.
And I think I see Ms. Garrett as well.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did someone speak before me? I don't have to talk right now.
That's okay. I was just gonna jump in. I was having some tech issues, so sorry for joining a little late, but it sounds like we're just kind of remembering some things. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, and as Tiffany was speaking, actually, as I read the assignment from Brett, I was remembering Ohio and growing up on the banks of the Cincinnati River that divided the slave states from the free states, and learning all about, again, Harriet Tubman with the National Underground Railroad that's situated there today in Ohio. And I remembered my high school 11th grade substitute history teacher, which was the first time that I'd ever had a Black male teacher in all of my upbringing. And he was the first individual that taught me that Africans on these shores had a history before slavery. And so, again, and we've gone into the conversation about intersectionality, but just the importance of knowing the full diversity, whether it's Arab American or African American or however we're identifying, of the cultures that were here. That really resonated. I know a number of individuals who just sort of shrink in kids in their seats today because they don't know that they have a long legacy before being associated with an enslaved culture. And then to think about the 27 million individuals that in some accounts that are still oppressed and enslaved, living enslaved today. So, this course has been great, and the work that the Progressive Network is doing to help us all remember the various histories whether you're from South Carolina or not, and how it has continuing reaches today and going forward. So again, Tiffany, it was just ironic that she happened to mention Harriet, and that was one of the early recollections of me remembering how I became woke, as they like to say today.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and it's clear. I think it also goes back to Dr. Gallman's point about how do we remember both the slave rebellions in rebellion of the enslaved as up to the Black Panther movement. So in all these ways, how do we have a fuller meaning, a full truth, and a fuller accounting, if not a full accounting, to the best of our ability of these moments. I will say that as a political scientist, I am always learning layers of history I had no clue about. and for me, it's a rewarding thing to, so don't feel badly, Tiffany, about knowing so much about South Carolina history. I learn as I go along. And I've also learned that there are elements about the history that are not all about shame. It's about the, the elements of the history that, we don't want necessarily to say heroic, but certainly there were heroic aspects. I'll just say this, that it becomes more difficult for us as modern day progressives to say, well, what are we to do if we have to make this up whole cloth? Well, we don't. And so knowing about the legacy of someone like a Modjeska Simkins, like a Septima Clark, like the sort of legions of individuals prior to and even now, has us say, well, we're not making up this model in South Carolina at all. South Carolina or anywhere else. Yeah. Other thoughts or other comments? And particularly any voices who haven't gotten an opportunity to chime in.
I just want to quick chime in and to say, well, first, I sent the wrong picture. I sent the picture of what a proper Bloody Mary looks like.
Okay. That might be useful at some point.
Memorial Day treat to the Progressive Network before Brett kicks me off while I'm sending a picture of alcoholic drinks. I had the wrong one saved on my desktop, but from Wisconsin, you all don't know how to do a proper Bloody Mary down here. No offense, but look at that picture for the proper garnishes that you. But I'm going to send a picture in the chat, and it relates to the article that Brett sent out by Blight. You oftentimes see this picture of the first Memorial Day in Charleston, and it's of the school children. Now, historically, I think Blight talks about 3,000 school children led that first Memorial Day parade, right? There's 3,000 of the 10,000 were school children. And given my work in education and history, I'm always looking at history of schools, how education has been used as resistance, from slave rebellions, of the Stoner Rebellion, and how they, South Carolina Carolina legislators, clamped down on education because they targeted that as a reason why people wanted to rebel, because they could read about the Spanish Proclamation of Freedom. And looking at the first Memorial Day, we're really not taught about the role of children and how schools and schooling and education were sites of resistance. And anytime since I moved to the South in 2011, the first thing I did in Charleston was look up the history of education in Charleston. And of course, that leads us to Black education and the long freedom struggle, if you will, about the efforts to establish a school for young kids was oftentimes an act of resistance. And in Columbia, I'm reminded of the Howard School, which no longer exists. So we do have two historic markers to document that. And it just proves to me, this is connected to statements of Miss Garrett, right, about how we teach our kids and how this continues to be a site of resistance or a site of maintaining oppression. So I oftentimes think that though we are constantly educating ourselves and our children, we don't always take a step back to kind of say, well, what are we teaching our children and why? right? So I like to ask at the first Charleston Memorial Day, why were the children up front and why? Besides a nice way to start a procession, there's really something to that, to raise the next generation knowing who died in this cause and for what reasons, right? So I think that oftentimes we see education as a sort of innocuous, apolitical space, but history tells us that in fact, it is quite politicized, and it oftentimes is the foundation of resistance, and South Carolina proves that. And this is one reason why I'm so honored to be part of the South Carolina Progressive Network's Modjeska School, is that this continues this very long tradition of educating for resistance. And in this particular case, it's quite explicit that we're learning a history of South Carolina and then asked to apply this in our own projects, right? This is a way education should function, right? So I think this is something that we don't think about enough or aren't taught in school. We don't pass on, unless we're fortunate enough to take a class like this. It's just important. And perhaps this day is a day to consider or reflect upon how, if we follow the children, we understand a greater truth that as adults we oftentimes forget. And if I may segue this into calling out, if she's listening, Miss Carol Singletary, who I see joins us tonight, is executive director of Columbia Freedom School. And like Brett, I think, Carol carries forth the tradition of education for change by educating our young people in the community, in this case at Francis Burns United Methodist Church, and how this gathering of a freedom school in Columbia is also a direct link and connection to the long freedom struggle, and how there's certain spaces where we don't think to look, but we can certainly look, and Ms. Singletary certainly allows us the opportunity to see that. And maybe call on her to say a few words today. I think she's still muted, but.
Okay.
I'm trying.
Oops.
Muted. Okay, I'm unmuted.
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Hale. Dr. Hale is a staunch supporter of Freedom School and has been a supporter of Francis Burns Freedom School. One of the things I understand is that young people need to learn about reading, writing, and arithmetic, as they used to say during my time. But there's a lot of other things they need to learn that they don't learn in school, that we can help them learn through a freedom school. And this will be helpful. We're planning on doing it this year. We're just kind of watching COVID-19, but this will be our 7th year of educating young African-American kids about who they are and how important they are, and really trying to give them something to move forward. Because you can't just have what you have and keep it to yourself if you're really about growing your community. So one of the first things that has happened with this is that the young people have found a real sense of importance in themselves. So when they go back into the school settings, they are participating, doing well in school, making better grades. Parents are behaving, because one of the things you have to do is Freedom School, there are 2 things that we don't do in Freedom School. We don't put you out for your misbehavior, because that's what everybody else does. And so you can misbehave all you want, and you might go talk to the project director, but you're not going to be put out. You're going to be, and we're going to talk to your parents. And we have to have parental involvement. And so with that, parents have said repeatedly how their kids have really, their school years have meant so much more to them because they feel worthy and they have a level of self-confidence. And I think that's one of the things that sometimes our kids don't have. And we don't necessarily know how to show that and share that. And that's one of the things that we do at Freedom School. You got to know who you are. And we teach you who you are through the things that we teach in the books that we use. And that, you know, we don't teach reading, but we teach a lot, helping them learn a love for reading. So if you read, you have a really better understanding of what's going on with you in the world. So Freedom School, we're going to always be there for them and not put them out of school, but the parents have to play a role in helping to ensure that their kids come in with the right attitude and get what they need and go on and to do better things in this world. So this will be our 7th year. My church has been actually funding this school for the last 6 years, and hopefully they will fund, I mean, it's in our budget. We put it in our budget to fund Freedom School, which is, it's about $40,000, a little over $40,000 a year, almost $50,000 a year. And so besides the administrative budget and trustee budget, that's the highest budget that we have in our church. But we have, and it wasn't easy, but I don't back down real easily. So when they tried to push me away, I'm going, no, this is good. We're having this. And that, you know, and what happened, the first year or so, although the church supported it financially, the church didn't support it. The membership didn't support it. Over the last few years, because I wasn't going away. And I insist that this is what we need to do for our kids. And so we have lots of, we literally raise half of the budget from donations that the church gave over, the members of the church gave over and above their tithing. So yeah, we're doing all that we can to make sure that we are ordering masks. I've already bought hand sanitizer. We're ordering thermometers. We're doing everything we can to hopefully, one of the things that's so important to me, and I struggle every year because I need to make sure these young people are safe. And this year is probably going to be more important than any other year. So if we see that the death rate is going up and that things are getting worse, we won't do it. But if things are, the numbers are going up because they're doing more testing, but we got to make sure that that it's going to be safe. And we talked to Dr. Bell last week. Dr. Linda Bell is a member of our church. I mean, we had a church meeting last Wednesday night. We met Wednesday night, last Thursday night. And we asked her about it. And one of the things she said, we just follow the guidelines, and she thought it was important that we do it. So we're going to try to go forth with it. So Freedom School, you're invited to come and observe us. It's open to everybody. But our young kids are benefiting from Freedom School. Thank you, Dr. Hale. He's on our board.
Thank you so very much. I guess one question would be, would you mind, Mrs. Singletary, to talk about just the origins of the school a bit? Because of course we've heard that term Freedom School before. And so could you talk just a little bit about the history? Because you certainly have given us the purpose of the school.
Yeah, Freedom School started in Mississippi Delta. And Dr. Hale has a better grasp on it probably than I do, but it started in Mississippi Delta when freedom riders were down trying to register people to vote. And the thing that they realized is people couldn't read. So they set up these schools, freedom schools, under the tree, in the barn, in the backyard, in the church, wherever, bringing people together to try to teach them how to read. And most of you all know Marion Wright Edelman, who is from South Carolina, from Bennettsville. She was an attorney in the Mississippi Delta, and so was exposed to the Freedom School concept. So some 40 years ago, as president CEO of Children Defense Fund, she started Freedom School in South Carolina, in Bennettsville, South Carolina. Now, Freedom School is probably in 25 states. But it started as a mechanism to teach adults how to read. But also young people were a part of the reading process, but they were trying to get people registered to vote. So it started in Mississippi Delta, but Marion Wright Edelman is the one who brought it to South Carolina and made it national. So it is run by the Children Defense Fund, but a lot of the machinery to run Freedom School is really still in Bennettsville, South Carolina.
Todd, let me suggest that this is the reason that Carol Singletary is one of our co-chairs. And
Hey.
I want a little kind of memo from management here is that when the Modjeska School was started initially with the idea that we have to train up teachers and we have to be training organizers to be able to move towards being K through 12 or K through postdoc, I think is the way I first wrote it up. And that we're at the point now where we really do have 100 graduates and we really need to move on to the next phase. And we have within our midst people that are PhD childhood educators on discrimination and things like that. And Jon Hale certainly one of them. And Berta Bariz, who's got her PhD in that, taught that in Boston. And she's in Columbia now. So we have the ability, Carol, with your help, to start doing more with the school in terms of reaching young people. But we're training teachers to go do that because we can't solve all our problems here. And I want to point out also that this forgetting why we remember, it's such a hard thing to get my mind around. But I forget why we remember that the children have reasonably adequate education here is so they don't know history and they have to repeat it. See, the students that were in Modjeska's class when she was teaching her Leadership Training Institute at Allen University in 1946, while she was organizing Southern Negro Youth Congress chapters. Nobody at Allen knows that now. Nobody. And they don't want them to because they have to relive history and they won't be fighting for the same thing in a continuum, organizing beyond their own community, a multi-racial, multi-issue class of working people suffering the same oppression. Because if we get that message across, we're going to be dangerous. Excuse my
Thank you, Brett. Other questions or other comments? Other questions, other comments? Particularly given Mrs. Singletary's wonderful presentation about the Freedom School. Yeah, Lewis?
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Some of the work I've done is around youth, and also I'm old enough to relate to the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And we've tried to talk about, in a freedom school or any school that expects to have a self-governing democracy, we need to teach the 3 C's of thinking: critical thinking, creative thinking, and courageous thinking, because you got to be all 3 if you're going to really be an engaged citizen. So I really appreciated your comments, and I'm a big fan of Marion Wright Edelman for decades.
All right. Other thoughts? Other thoughts? Other thoughts, good folks.
Just as an aside, I'd like to, at some point, speak with Ms. Singletary My group a few years ago, Project Sankofa, did a series of rites of passage programs for the Children's Defense Fund in Bennettsville. We were under Marion Wright Elliman's sister, Olive. And those actually went really well. And many of our graduates of that program are now doing well, many of whom actually created rites of passage programs of their own. So, Ms. Singletary, I'd like to talk to you at some point.
Okay. Brett has my number.
Okay.
Yes, and he'll give it to you, and we can talk.
You know Alonio Jackson?
Pardon me?
You know Alonio Yvonne Jackson?
Yeah, she works with me.
I know.
She works with us with the Freedom School. I
As a
just
matter of
talked to
fact,
her not long ago. Pardon me?
her husband is part of the group that
Okay.
did that.
And Alonio has my number and
Okay,
everything. Yeah, I know her well.
very good.
Okay, but I'll be glad to talk to any of you. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Hale.
Can I ask the group a question?
Yes.
So being new here and finding how much South Carolina history relates to Florida history, something that came to my mind listening to all of you talk. Is there anything that you can think of that would make you proud to be from South Carolina? Any piece of history that you look back on that makes you proud to be a South Carolinian? Because there are things that make me proud to be a Floridian. There are things that make me ashamed to be a Floridian. So I've heard a lot of this history, and I've heard a couple of good things here and there, but I know mainly we're talking about things that we need to change. But what are things, if anything, that makes you proud to be from South Carolina?
I'm going to solicit for the group to respond, but I'm not a native South Carolinian, but there's a lot I claim about South Carolina that makes me proud. I'll leave it there for right now.
I am a native South Carolinian, and I think that one of the things that, I don't know if it's being from South Carolina makes me proud, but just the work that my parents and my foreparents did as it relates to civil rights in South Carolina. My dad lost his job in the 50s because he was secretary of NAACP, but that didn't stop him, and he fought on until his death and taught me how to fight. So, I mean, there were some leaders, and unfortunately, they were mostly men. And I guess and I say unfortunately because maybe, I'm not sure why women didn't get involved, but they welcomed me in and gave me the tools that I needed to have to continue with the struggle. So it was the people in South Carolina that did that for me, and I'm proud about that. The one thing that when I worked for the state and I managed programs, and I had people on my staff that were not from South Carolina that would always complain about South Carolina, and my response was very clearly, we didn't come looking for you. You came to us. And if you're coming to South Carolina, then you need to have some respect for it. So, I mean, that's just kind of my attitude about it. But the fight, the struggle that we sustain, and I'm from Lake City, South Carolina, so that's a small community, and everybody knows about Dr. Reverend Delane from Lake City, but Reverend Delane was from Clarendon County, but he was there, and so my dad was with him fighting, and we had a lot of fighters, I mean, a lot of strong civil rights leaders during that time who gave up a lot and risked a lot because as a young child, I was like 3 when my dad lost his job, but having to sit up all night because people are threatening to shoot in your house, and you got to be up protecting your family. So, you know, I don't run away from a good fight because that had been instilled in me for a good reason. Not, you know, I'm not going to fight just to fight, but if you bring it on and it's a good fight, you know, I'm with you. So I think that's some of the things that I have learned, and I think there are many South Carolinians who have really. It's like one of the things people always talk about, and Dr. Gallman, I appreciate what you said. People often talk about Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and all of them, and I don't have anything against those people, but there were so many people that really, even before their time, were fighting that nobody acknowledge and remember. So I'm proud that I was taught how to really stand up for what's right, whomever it comes from. If it's right, it's right.
Yeah, Tiffany, that's the essence of the people's history. That's what we're learning here in the first 7 classes of the Progressive Network, is that these things we feel, this inherent sense we feel of self-importance, that we can do something, we can be somebody, has been felt ever since the beginning. Then everybody's got that right to feel that. And it gets suppressed. And I could start with Queen Ceci, who was the Cherokee leader before white folks came and had a wonderful society before they got killed. And Denmark Vesey is somebody that I just think is my freedom fighter, and he's another man's terrorist, right on up to where Miss Modjeska's mother was one of the original members in the Niagara movement with Du Bois in 1905. And then her mother started a school. And the Modjeska was Modjeska, and that. So we don't have to start from the beginning if we remember history. We don't have to start over, and that's what we're forgetting to remember, is that we don't have to start over. They want us to forget that.
If I could add, I'm not only proud to be from South Carolina, I'm proud to be from Hartsville, South Carolina, because there is a tradition there of scholarship and activism that helped to guide me. And when you go back generations, South Carolina actually gave the country public education. If you look at some of the things that have come out of South Carolina, many things that have been adopted and claimed by other parts of the country had their origins here in South Carolina. And I think that's one of the good things, one of the many good things about this school, because we're learning those things, and hopefully we're being stimulated to go out and find out more. But South Carolina is special. When you look at a number of people who are doing something, whether it be positive, whether it be negative, whether it be flippant or serious, a large number of those people have their roots right here in South Carolina. So I think that that's something that we are to be proud of.
Could I ask Dr. Gallman to go a little bit further? You've struck my field of interest here. When I think about the origin of public schools in America, I instantly go to New England, where you get the concept of a common curriculum, the concept of the structure of a school and the school day, et cetera, the agricultural year, that sort of thing. So I'm curious to hear when you say that a lot of what we think about in public education originated in South Carolina. Can you touch on and offer some examples of that? I'm really fascinated at this.
Certainly. After, during Reconstruction, during the Reconstruction Congress, which was predominantly Black, one of the things that came out of that was free public education for everyone, rather than males, rather than landowners, for male and female, rich and poor. And that's one of the enduring legacies of that Reconstruction period in South Carolina.
So in some ways, it was the struggle to democratize the public school model under Reconstruction, right? Mm-hmm. Other voices of things that you are proud, and you can say it in the context of this particular school, because we tell full truths here. So, what are other things? If there are other responses, if not, I'll, as charged by Brett, I'll be the good moderator and call on a few folk if they haven't had a chance to. Well, I'm not going to pick on anybody, but if you haven't had a chance to chime in, I certainly want you to get an opportunity. Any other thoughts in that realm? The one downside to Zoom is you can readily remember people's names because you see them right in front of you. So, and I was a little. My apologies about being late today. I had to have just a little time with my family on the West Coast. But if you haven't had an opportunity to chime in and something's pricked your thoughts, so I see Annie and Kyle, Julie, Felicia. Any additional thoughts?
Hi.
Hey, Julie.
I didn't. I felt like you were talking to me, so I'm gonna chime in here. I feel. I mean, Dr. Gallman, what you just spoke about, kind of being proud and learning more things about South Carolina. That's where that's my takeaway from this class. I grew up in South Carolina. I went through public education in South Carolina. I certainly did not know anything. I mean, I'm relatively young and still kind of learning my progressive roots and where those are taking me. But I've been just so grateful to learn what I've learned in this class. And that, to go back to where Tiffany's question was, that has made me more proud of South Carolina, because I do think there was stuff that I just didn't know. And a lot of the big things that happen and the big progress that we've made in this country have a lot of roots in South Carolina. And I did not know that before. So that has made me more proud and proud of the progress that this state has made over the course of history, and make me hopeful for what we can do in the future. So.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
My only other thing is that I'm in my deep dive and kind of where this is going for me is, sorry, my dog is stuck in the cord. I'm in the real estate business and property management business. And so most of what I try to learn, I apply to my field, and how there's a lot of problematic things in both of those industries, in real estate development and property management. And there have been a lot of that over the course of time. So I've taken a lot of what we learned here and tried to research, okay, so how did that happen and how did it apply to the housing? If anybody has any specific things for South Carolina in terms of, historic housing related incidents or anything I can learn related to South Carolina, I think that I'm not sure exactly what the template for the project is, but I think for my own personal project, I think there's some things that I would like to do to try to influence, at least in my organization and that sort of thing, because I think it's important, just as we need to know history in order to make progress. I think that's also important as it relates to the things that people do daily, because I think there's a lot of blatant discrimination in real estate. I think there's some kind of microaggression in real estate industry. And I think that affects, can affect people's lives tremendously, because I do think that housing is a human right and people should have the opportunity equally to be able to live where they would like to live. So that's my only question, is it, and on deeper dive related to that very specific thing, if there's anything anybody can point me to, I'd be happy to dive into that and learn a little bit more.
Congratulations, Julie. You've just been appointed to the Progressive Network seat on the Fair Housing Bureau.
Okay.
I challenged them a few years back when they asked if they could use our picture of Modjeska Simkins to give an award. And any good bureaucrat, everybody that gets federal money has to have like an officer that's in charge of making sure they're not discriminating. Mm-hmm. And so in this group, there's the city, the county, the state, and everybody talking about their conforming with federal laws. And somehow we've managed to be the entity that is in charge of awarding the Modjeska Simkins Award. And this, every year it's different. Last year we gave the award to some undocumented dreamers for sticking up for their community, which blew everybody's mind. I was surprised it happened. And this year, we're working with the disability community to honor someone that works for fair housing in the disability community. So I'm going to plug you into that. You can run, but you can't hide now. Thank you.
Well, and I'm not hiding generally. I just have a house full of kids and a dog, and so I'm trying to keep everybody. But I'd be honored to participate however I can.
Right into your inbox soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Okay. This is Annie. I guess I dive in just for a minute.
Sure. Thank you.
I think I hadn't been as focused on the classes I know I should be, being that we're in the middle of a election, and I have somewhat of a, at least I'm telling myself it's a contentious fight. So I'm trying to fight extra hard. But I have participated in a lot of grassroots organizing and advocacy, civil rights issues in the state. I'm a lifelong resident of South Carolina. So some things I know from reading, some things I know from experience, and others from individuals that I know telling their versions of what has occurred. But what I really would just like to say is that a lot of what I have heard, it kind of put things in perspective as to where I am in a lot of things that I advocate for, and why we have a lot of African Americans who shy away from being, as I think I heard someone state earlier, that they will fight when there's something worth fighting for. But oftentimes when we need those fighters, they're not there. And a fight doesn't necessarily mean that you use fists, and it doesn't necessarily mean you use a harsh voice. Sometimes it means that you just question the status quo. And sometimes it means that you're diplomatic questioning that you shame them into doing what's right. So I will be repeating the class, but from what I've learned so far, a lot of it is just postured, in my experience, by people who know what's right, but just don't want to do what's right. And in my county of Fairfield, I have experienced that on so many levels. I experienced it on the school board when I tried to stand up for right for children, and I would let no one stand me down. I think they've tried to do everything from killing me to putting me in jail. But as long as I had God and a smile on my face, I didn't worry. So I just appreciate knowing those persons whose shoulder I stand on and some of the things that they experience, and how it helps me shape why some of the people won't stand and do what's right, and have a better understanding. I'm not going to say appreciation, but a better understanding for their position. But even with that being said, I would not let it stop me from taking on some issues. And I have quite a few right now I'm trying to take on that some I win and some I lose. But I just believe in doing right by people. I believe that's my calling. I believe that's what I'm here for. And I just want to thank you guys for the information that you provided, and helping me continue to shape those things that I advocate and fight for. So thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much. It's always helpful to know that we are not alone. All right. Other voices, other voices. Don't have me live by Brett's rule of calling on people. He'll talk with me after class and say, should have called on. But yeah, just want to provide an open space for a deeper dive. Deeper dive. Just for half a minute, I will respond to something that Burnettgallman said a while ago about the ways in which movements are not given due credit. And he and I could chat a little further about that. The more and more I study, and I see your camera there, Natavis. But the more and more I study the contributions of the Black Power movement, I recognize the contributions they made to what we understand to be Black electoral politics. And so from the Gary Convention to the election of Mayor Stokes in Cleveland, to the election of Coleman Young, much of that was rooted in activism that emerged out of the Black Power movement, distinct from the questions around the civil rights movement. And actually there's a decent number of books that talk more about the Black Power's contribution to the election of Black elected officials in that period of the late 60s and 70s, as much as the civil rights movement. So you're right to say it's really important to give due credit to movements and be mindful of that. Natavis, go ahead. I see you can.
Yes,
go ahead.
So, normally in a discussion, I sit and I listen. For what it's worth, I've only been in South Carolina for 1 year, and maybe 1 year and a month. And I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia, and I guess I can, to save myself from embarrassment, I'm gonna just give the disclaimer that I regret to have to say this, but I don't know all of my roots. I don't know exactly where my family comes from. Not from. I don't know even the first place to start. In more ways than one. And so I find this discussion every single week to be very intuitive in the way that we look at, I guess, culture, and also we look at Columbia in itself. So just a little background on me as well. I currently work for the Comet, and I'm a planner, transportation planner for them. And my entire career has been in transportation planning, but equally in planning, you deal with so many aspects, whether it's economic development, community planning, and working with data, and just any type of spatial analysis, and just trying to, figure out how we want to plan around different populations, whether it's an aging population or just a growing population. So we look at life in so many different aspects. And I guess sometimes what I wonder though is just, before I even say that, I think what I find most interesting is, along my, I guess through the course of my career, is understanding how different cities came to be. And just even looking at from a downtown Columbia standpoint, the size of the buildings to the outskirts of the way the homes are made in those communities, in comparison to a place like Atlanta, where you see a little bit more of a higher dense type of infrastructure opposed to Columbia. And then you see different cultures of people in Columbia where they don't want buildings that are too tall. They have a passion around wanting to be able to see things at a certain perspective, and being able to see the river, and it kind of changes the way things grow. But equally, I guess I wonder from a Columbia perspective, if I were to question anything, is how exactly has all the history that we talked about, how has it shaped, I guess, the way that Columbia has developed up to this point from a cultural standpoint, and where do African Americans fit into that fold of those changes that took place? How did Benedict College end up on that side of town versus another side of town? Like, I just wonder, like, it's just exactly how things started to develop as time started to progress. And maybe you can shed some light on that, but that's the history that I don't always hear and see. I remember one of the first projects that I worked on when I was here. Well, one of the projects I heard about when I first arrived to Columbia was a bike lane that was on Farrell Road. And maybe some people know about that project, but it was a bike lane they put out there. The people in the Farrell Road community along that corridor, they were upset because they felt like, why would you put this bike lane in my community? You're just trying to run me out of here. Police were starting to I guess you could say frisk, drivers. They would give them tickets because they were driving in the bike lane, and they were not used to being in that type of, I guess, environment where you had that type of infrastructure. And that's fair enough. But I guess it's like, just looking at the overall culture, I want to understand how plans are developed. It's one thing for me to sit in a meeting and advocate for what I know the groupthink is, but it's another perspective when I understand that there's a deeper story behind what I'm planning around and some of the ideas that are coming across the table. And I want to make sure I can plan to the best of my ability for a growing community. I mean, for all cultures, of course, but just making sure I understand. I want to make a well-rounded decision anytime I'm making a decision. So hopefully I'm not being too winded, but I just want to throw that out there and ask that question to, I guess, to the panelists, and if you can help me out, and from my perspective and my vantage point.
Can I just say that Mr. Harris, your job is so essential, because transportation is, especially for me as a non-driver, and I've heard about you. I know who you are. You're famous around my office. But transportation is a way that I'm oppressed, and it's a way that so many people are oppressed. It's a way that people with disabilities are oppressed, and it's a way that they keep us oppressed. It's a way that minorities all across the board are oppressed. It's a way people of different races are oppressed. It's a way that people of low income are oppressed. And it's so important that we realize that it's also a way that our environment is oppressed. And I think that one of the things that we need to take out of this virus, and something that we can really learn that it could be a positive, is that the cars haven't been on the road, and the planet is healing, right? And if we could expand our public transportation options and make them more viable, then not only could we heal each other, but we could heal our planet. And so, go out there and speak truth to power, please. And so you have me behind your back, all the way, all the time.
No, absolutely. I really appreciate that. I definitely, I used to be the bicycle and pedestrian planner. And literally in the blink of an eye, I went over to the Comet as a planning and development specialist, but I still work with bicycle related planning. So, and infrastructure. So we try our best to partner with some of the funds that we have from FTA, and see what we can do to, kind of collaborate with the city to expand our bike share system, even any other micro transit system as well, like whether it's electric scooters, things of that sort. So we just try our best to do what we can, but absolutely, I really appreciate that. And I can give you my word that I would do whatever I can to make sure I continue to advocate for people like you.
Natavius, I have a gift for you. I feel like a quiz show host awarding people things behind door number 3. At the beginning of this millennium, I think it was about 1999, Richland County created a 2020 Vision Committee. And Virginia Sanders, who I see lurking behind her telephone here, Virginia and I represented the Progressive Network, and I was on the Racial Disparity Task Force, and she was on another one. And one of the things we worked up with the help of Representative Jon Hale and the Institute for Social Inclusion in New York was overlays of development based on race that just went for decades. Look at there! Look at all the sewer. Oh, look at the sewer lines stop before they get to the Black community. Well, oh, look at the buses. It's just like, there you go. What else you need to know? And so we're trying to dig those things up, and you'll be a recipient of them when we do. But that reality is still there, and just that portrayal of it in a visual way was impactful. And the comment, let me tell you, that Natavius and Brittany Higgins, who's now working with AbleSC, Brittany worked with us when we got the penny for the transportation in 2000. And Brittany's now with Able, and the leadership of the Comet now, John Ando, is one of our students who is perhaps busy this evening, but staying in touch. And so the Comet is the regional transportation agency that is trying to turn back generations of racial infringement by our transportation plan. I mean, when I was growing up, the buses left town at 6 to get the Black people out of town, and that was it. And there weren't any late buses. We didn't want you in town. And I remember a big fight many years ago with Strom Thurmond turning down money for that the feds were offering to make the buses handicap accessible. I'm not quite sure what his rationale was. I'm sure it has something to do with poor people. So thank you, Natavius. Appreciate you in South Carolina now.
No, absolutely. I guess I can add this just for a point of reference. And I'm curious to do more research on this. My background is in economics and political science, but for what it's worth, I'm curious to know how transportation possibly shifted populations of people in different cultures, demographics, into different communities. Because even to this day, and I don't know if this is going to be alarming to anyone, but I can admit that I have received phone calls. I've heard people literally verbally out of their mouth admit that they do not want the bus in their neighborhood, primarily because of Black people being the primary people that are utilizing transit. And I've seen it in letters multiple times. I received a phone call. I've heard people say on speakerphone in someone else's office because they felt like they can, I guess when, you feel like you can relate culturally to someone else of their same ethnicity. I've heard someone, speak to someone and say, listen, those Black guys, those Black folks in that office, they don't know what they're doing. And, it's just even from that perspective. And then we have a pretty diverse team of people, but it's just like, for what it's worth, you see that culture. So I'm curious to know, and I know it's a hard question for you to answer, but or for anybody maybe, but for what it's worth, I mean, I'm curious to know how transportation probably shifted the culture or I guess the movement of people in the Columbia area to different places. There was a map that I saw when I first moved to Columbia, and it showed a population map of where everyone was located demographically. And Columbia is kind of funny, but it's almost like, pretty much every white person is in one area primarily, and every Black person is in one area primarily, and it's literally a straight divide across the map. And I thought that was interesting, because I'm coming from a place like Atlanta where it does seem like things are a little bit more inclusive. Not saying that everything is perfect, but, when I was looking at Columbia, it's just, I wonder how deep rooted some of, I guess, the history of slavery and just the social divide, how deep rooted is it, in a place like this. And I think this school, the Modjeska school, it kind of helps me to be able to figure out some of those things and connect some dots. And so I really appreciate that. So
I will add this one thing, Natavius. I gave you a link to the Ward 1 project, and that's one of others that speak about the whole issue of urban renewal and redlining as affected that very historic community, but there are other communities in South Carolina as well. There's also a doctoral student by the name of Maurice Robinson, who just completed his doctorate in history, Maurice did not get a chance to do anything extensive about Columbia, South Carolina, but he has looked at, but I think Maurice collected sources, and he does have information with regards to Birmingham as well as Atlanta with regards to the Federal Highway Act and the way in which it was used as a tool of segregation.
Wow.
And that is a story that I'm certain has some aspect of a South Carolina correlate to it. So if you really kind of want to know about that, we could chat a little bit more. And certainly Brett reminded me of talking to Maya Wiley from the Center for Social Inclusion many years ago about that Richland County plan. But you can say it's a history of past and present urban renewal as combined with redlining and gentrification that these patterns of transportation have helped to shape. And no, it's not any accident that Columbia was and still confronts levels of residential segregation that it does. Atlanta does as well, as though, by the way. Atlanta's always that, the city too busy to hate. Too busy to care, actually. But anyway, every city has its myth.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you very, very much. Other comments? We have about 15 more minutes or so, good folks. About 15 more minutes or so. Other comments, if you haven't gotten a chance to chime in just a little. Yeah, or if you want to circle back around with a thought, we can permit that as well. But again, I keep putting this on Brett Bursey that there are no spectators.
Well, Doc, I want to point out that that both Julie and Natavius are the class examples that we'll deal with in class 10. See, at the end of this thing, the whole idea is to empower you to go make change in whatever way that fits with what you want to do. And Julie can work with this project that we have that's exactly what she's talking about with this discrimination in housing as her project for her practicum for the Modjeska School. And Natavius, we're going to dig up, I didn't know Todd knew Maya, but we're going to dig up these overlays that we've been looking for. Representative Neal is one of the founders of the network, and he passed 2 Februarys ago, and we don't know where anything is. And so these big overlays that we had that we showed repeatedly are MIA, but we're going to track them down and to empower each of you to have something that you want to do that uses the shoulders that we've been building and standing on for decades and generations. And so that's kind of one of the missions, the end cap of the Modjeska School is to set you forth to make change.
Okay.
Cecil?
Fred, can you talk a little bit more about the project expectations or the expectations around this project element? I've heard several references to it, but I don't know any more than that, and I regret. I showed up a little bit late to the orientation session at the very beginning, so if there was some
right. Well, unfortunately, Cecil, you should have read the fine print before you gave us your money. We got you now. Now, the pitch is that this is not drive-by here. We're doing this to be able to empower people to be effective citizens. And we're kind of like gentle about that. I mean, you can be whatever you are in your life and be an effective citizen. You don't have to drop everything and become literally an organizer that spends all their life doing that, because we need effective citizens that are postal workers and school teachers and real estate people and bus drivers and whatnot. And so we'll work with you, Cecil. But clearly your interest in public education is something that we really want to leverage. We have a project that can just change a lot in South Carolina. That is, again, one of these things that we lifted up in 2008. And I think I've talked about it before, when Gilda Cobb-Hunter was on the Joint Bond Review Committee that is in charge of all acquisitions and dispositions of state property. And she handed me this big folder and she said, do this. And this was the creation of South Carolina Broadband Commission to dispose of the extra educational broadband. Well, I didn't even know what broadband was. And by the time I finished, I realized nobody else knew what happened. But over a period of 8 months, this commission determined what they went in to determine was to take South Carolina's educational broadband and give it to the telecom industry so it would not be used publicly, because that would be socialism. And so because of our racist history, we're the only state in the nation that the state owns all the broadband licenses, 63 licenses, 700 towers. We could have broadband for every kid in South Carolina, everybody. We own the nation's only public broadband system. And I'm working with people whose name I can't mention here online, but I will be willing to conspire with you to do a model, because we won. They wanted us to keep 5%, which the license holder, like in North Carolina and Georgia, you got community stations, the university has stations. In South Carolina, they're owned, and the educational level of SCE TV and radio in South Carolina is measured by the stupidest legislator that sits on their budget. So that's part of, Southern by the grace of God and stupid by choice. So we have got 20% that we kept over the 5 that the people can use. It's never been done. And so we're working on getting that together in this time of COVID, when just in the last week, I've heard the superintendent of education say that it's a tragedy because there's 140,000 households that can't get broadband for their students, and they're parking buses in the neighborhood so you can go out. Kind of the reverse thing of like what happened in the Clarendon County case where the buses drove by the kids. Well, they're going to drive them by the kids now so they can get some broadband while it drives by. And so the idea is to have a model of this that we can then organize. And but we have things that are such shocking things that the state does to people that it's hard to communicate. One of them is not using the broadband system at a time when Obama was talking about closing the digital divide. Everybody talks about doing this, and we own it, and we haven't been able to access it. So that's your project. So that's what we're doing. We're looking for things that need to be done that already you can come up with a new thing, but already tremendous base of work that's not being followed through because we don't have money and staff.
Can we talk further?
We trust me, I have your phone number. We'll be in touch.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
There's still a few minutes left here, Dr. Shaw.
Yes.
I want to just point out that the next class, Lewis Pitts, Lewis is signed off. Lewis is going to be presenting next class, and the next class is political theory. So we're moving into the subjective portion of the Modjeska School. The first piece we would like to think of is our objective telling of history. And we didn't make it up, this is the real deal. And so that people's history is the first 7 classes that helps you understand who made the rules, who benefited from the rules, who benefits from them now, and damn if they aren't the same rules. And oh, look, it's the same people benefiting. Well, so our analysis of what the theories are that we should organize around is class 8, 9, 10, yeah, class 8, which is next June 1, next Monday. And there's a really important piece here about corporations and the history of corporations. And there's really important stuff to read, but Pitts was involved in the founding of a group called POCLAD, the Project on Law, POCLAD, Project on Corporations, Law and Democracy, maybe 15 years old, and it was a bunch of left-wing lawyers that got together. And it just created a tremendous base of educational material about the way corporations have become people. And so Lewis is going to help with that. And this is Todd Shaw's time to shine as a political scientist. We're talking about political theory. And so our analysis is drawn from the theory that we understand that we're sharing with you. And then the theory practice, the practice class is the last thing we do. We do analysis, strategy, and tactics and theory in those last 3 classes. And you will be responsible in that 10th class for picking a project and then coming back at our graduation, which we're going to do some type of survey. We had this grand plan with dinner and everything planned that we may have, but it ain't gonna be in my house. So we're open to looking at the date that's now set for July 3rd. And we wanted to wrap this thing up before July 4th, and that's about as far as we can put it off. And that's a Friday night. It's scheduled right now for Friday that we can amend that, but I'm going to do somehow a survey monkey and get people's opinions. But we want each of you to come to graduation, whether that's at Zoom or Becky's got this great plan for a drive-by thing in the big parking lot next to the Modjeska house, where we have our drum and kazoo band that comes in, and our suited up people hand you your diploma, and we congratulate you. But everybody has to, at that point, say a few words about, this is how I'm going to put my learnings from the school to work. And so that kind of takes us up to you going out and hitting the trenches, because we have projects, tremendous projects, with not enough people to do them. And so that's what you're about. I'm sorry you've been roped into this, but we've got a job for you, each of you.
Brett, do you want everyone to come up with just a 5 or 10-minute presentation? What are you thinking along those lines?
Yeah, I would share some of the things we've done in the past, and that we have the projects that we have. They're listed in the Modjeska class, the last class we did. They're on our website. Like the one I just mentioned to Cecil is one that's fallen off the broadband. We need to lift that back up. The one I talked to Julie about, we've never really organized input to it. We need people to write herd on that. We've been doing what we've been doing long enough to one thing that's happened is some of the people that are running the state and county agencies, there are friends. Mm-hmm. That I'm finding now that I have more rapport with the people running the Senate Finance Committee than the senators do. I mean, I've got guards at the State House whispering in my ear that their bosses are crazy. And so this is the opportunity we're preparing to take advantage of, and we need help to be able to take advantage of all the opportunities.
Okay.
And so I will see everybody here next Monday night at 6:30, and trust that you will have done your homework.
Before we adjourn, there's a couple of comments in the chat box, one of which is that there's a shameless plug for the Freedom School. So thank you again, Mrs. Singletary. We really do appreciate you being here and the wonderful presentation you've made. Then there was a question about the rites of passage, and I think Dr. Burnettgallman is happy to share that literature and that model with you. By the way, Dr. Gallman, I've used that in a other setting as well, in terms of a rites of passage I did with a church in Charlotte, North Carolina. Then let's see, there is, I shared the information about Ward 1, just as a great discussion about the impact, the historic impact of redlining and urban renewal on that community, and where the Coger Center sits now with the University of South Carolina. There is a community that still exists, but the buildings are not there. Then Ms. Dawson raised the question. I agree. There's a good to the question about housing. That is a great documentary that breaks the power illusion. The House We Live In. The House We Live In is a great discussion about racial discrimination, urban renewal history, the old discussion about urban renewal. As was said in the 1960s, urban renewal is a plan for Negro and people of color removal, as folk would say in that period. So that's a great documentary for that. And then let's see, yes, the document is specific to South Carolina, but yeah, it gives an overall great history. And Brett means to say our theory is dialectical, okay. And at this time, UofSC, it was home to 2 oratorical societies. Does the network host a speakers bureau or prior graduates in their specialties? Okay, so maybe Ceci, if you want to raise that question for our conversation in the next week or so, because we're coming to that point where in the course where we're giving practicum takeaways. So that would be a great point. And I know you and Brett will have a conversation. Yeah. Go ahead, Brett.
He knows.
Okay. Any other final comments? Any other final comments? All righty.
Bye-bye, folks. Stay safe.
Okay, thank you now. All right, have a good one.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night,
Dr.
everyone.
Gallman, call me.
Bye-bye, Carol.
Okay.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, Dr. Gallman. Come back from Egypt, man. We miss you.
That's when I was there a few years ago.
Oh, you've been blocking the real picture. I would not let you in my country. Becky reminds me I have to turn the recording off.
Okay.